Once upon a time, Britain's car industry was the envy of the world. And during this halcyon era, one particular name came to epitomise everything to which the driver of taste aspired.
The Rover was built with care, and they were quality machines.
You had incredible technical innovation.
A gear lever that clicks in and out perfectly with lovely mechanical rifle bolt actions. It's a beautifully precise machine.
In 2005, this once blue-chip brand reached the end of the road. But hidden in this saga of industrial decline is a cautionary tale of British design.
Some of them, you just had to show them a damp chamois, and they'd start rusting.
So buckle up for the story of Rover cars, and how they went from defining their eras to being victims of their times. When the first Rover cars eased onto the nation's roads in 1904, motoring was a luxury pastime for the elite. They demanded the finest craftsmanship, and Rover soon became a byword for quality.
Well, the very name Rover's a delightful one, isn't it? It's what the Victorians used to call their dog. Here, Rover, it's just that. You can imagine going out to the garage of your mock Tudor house in Totteridge or Weybridge and saying, "Here, Rover," opening the garage door, and out would come purring this wonderful, stately, loyal, reliable car, as decent and as reliable as your Labrador or as your Bulldog.
This Rover car was a model of executive decorum.
Rovers were well-behaved middle-class cars. Elegant and refined, with well-dressed interiors of polished wood and leather, they were like a gentleman's club on wheels. Rover was the car of the professional, the doctor, the solicitor. More than mere cars, they represented respectability.
There was something quintessentially English about them, in that they had there was an element of sophistication, but it was always understated. There was a solidity and gentility and a sort of good manners.
When I think of a Rover, I think of a tweedy headmaster covered in chalk, still wearing his gown perhaps and smoking a pipe and reading the Times whilst trying to drive, and there's a big slobbering black Labrador next to him here.
I think of Middle England, I think of Surrey, and one didn't lock the car outside the pub. In fact, one even left the ignition key in the dashboard, because that way you wouldn't lose it after 4 or 5 pink gins.
The results of this continuing policy are apparent today, when Rover cars of the 1930s, nursed by their owners with all the loving care that such a car commands, are still in heavy demand.
The company's early confidence was matched by its name, inspired by the most famous Rovers of all, the Vikings.
Actually, it had a rather racy badge, though, the Rover, a Viking longship, suggesting something actually rather different. I mean, sort of Jolly Rogering rovering, the sort of rovering that Vikings did, which was about rape and pillage. But that's rather odd. I think it's just a Victorian notion of seeming grand and dynamic and exciting.
Riding high at the end of the 1930s, Rover faced a major setback when war broke out and its Coventry plant was targeted by the Luftwaffe.
Only one thing was not destroyed in that night of baptism by fire: the will to win. The Rover Company made a fighting comeback. In a shadow factory at Solihull and elsewhere, it started making Meteor engines for the Cromwell tank. Hercules and Lysander aircraft were also to be a part of the company's contribution to the war effort.
Rover's own fight didn't end with the war. The motor industry faced years of austerity and fuel rationing. But the plucky chaps at Rover rose to the challenge in an unexpected way, transforming old wartime components into a surprise success.
A few years after the war, the Rover Company produced the Land Rover, most versatile wheeled vehicle ever made. This complete departure from routine car manufacture surprised the world.
The Land Rover was taken from the Willys Jeep, the World War II, what the Americans called the car that won World War II.
Came out in 1948, and the boss of Rover, he'd taken a Willys Jeep from an ex-World War II Willys Jeep down on his farm, and he thought, this is good. So they copied it, but they had no steel, so they made it out of aluminium. And it was really very accidental, the whole thing. Nobody could have predicted the success of the Land Rover. So it debuted at the 1948 Motor Show, and everybody thought it was great. And demand just massively, massively outstripped supply. It came at a time when utilitarianism and wholesomeness and practicality were really strong British virtues. And they had to restrict demand, and only, important people like doctors and midwives were able to get it for at least sort of 4 or 5 years. It was sold all around the world. They were massively, massively popular.
The Land Rover had a huge impact on Rover. It was originally intended as a stopgap in order to keep the company ticking over after the war before the car market went back to normal. But in fact it became so successful that for most of the 1950s, Rover really were a company supported by the Land Rover.
Fueled by the Land Rover's success, Rover rode confidently into the 1950s. This would be the company's golden age. Freed at last from fuel rations and steel shortages, the car market was open for business again. Rover was able to return to producing cars for the great and the good.
We were all very proud that Britain, after the war, got back on its feet, had an industry, had a car industry. And so there was a kind of pride in being British, I would say. And I think Rover did symbolise that to quite a considerable extent, because it was a car one aspired towards.
And no car would sum up the era, or Rover itself, better than the legendary P5.
This, for me, is Rover at its absolute zenith. The P5. This is just, the best of Rover and the best that Britain could make.
It was very much a middle-class car. It was seen as a stylish, reliable, efficient, comfortable kind of car.
In the post-war years, to own a Rover became more and more a desirable objective, and production increased with demand. Once a driver had owned a Rover, it raised his appreciation of what pleasure and satisfaction such a good car could give.
What's so great about it? You have this thumping, wonderful engine that made it go like stink, but it had this incredible establishment grandeur.
They smelt nice. They looked nice. They were regal. And let's face it, Buckingham Palace had a couple of them. The Queen was quite happy with her Rover 3-litre.
This was a summit car. Every Prime Minister had one of these. You'd see them in all the newsreels. Thatcher, Callaghan, Wilson, Heath, all getting out of P5s.
P5 was favoured by, Princess Grace and the royal family, a car of, of really, quite exceptional dignity.
Car doors don't make this noise anymore. That's not a door, that's a vault.
And just in terms of the aesthetics of car design, a genuine original.
It is just Rover at its absolute best.
The P5 appeared to be a very British thoroughbred, but a closer look revealed all was not what it seemed. Lurking under the bonnet of the flagship coupe model was someone else's engine. This wouldn't be the last time Rover stuck their badge on somebody else's engineering.
Buick had this a surplus of 3.5-litre V8 engines, which they'd put in their pickup. And somebody very bright in Rover, I can't remember who it was, said, "Okay, we'll buy these. We'll put it in the P5. We'll call it the coupe, the P5B, and see what happens." And instantly, this car became the car you aspired to if you had any money at all.
Freed from the tedious chore of actually having to design engines for their regular cars, Rover's engineering team were busy developing prototype technology for the drivers of the future.
The engineering department was hard at work on all sorts of innovative engineering, And most importantly, I think, was the idea that they could replace the conventional piston engine in a Rover car with a gas turbine engine.
With Jet 1, the original model, now in the Science Museum, research is forging ahead. And this base unit is used for development, a mobile test bed.
This had come out of some work they'd been doing on Rolls-Royce aero engines during the war. But it was brought through right through the 1950s in a number of interesting prototypes, and right through to the early 1960s, when they actually demonstrated how far they'd got with this technology by getting together with the people who built the BRM racing car and making a car which is now known as the Rover BRM, which ran at Le Mans.
Rover was a very innovative company, funnily enough, although we associate it with, grandness and Englishness and blimpishness and tweed jackets and old dogs. In fact, they made gas turbine cars. They made cars that could take on the latest cars and pretty much lick them hollow. They made cars that were dynamic and quite razzmatazzy.
Alongside their cutting-edge sports cars, Rover was keeping pace with changing trends. The P5 had been designed to amble down Britain's A roads, but by the 1960s, the new motorways dictated a faster style of motoring. It was the dawn of a new era of affluence, and a new middle class was emerging which sought a car with a bit more dash. Fingers still firmly on the pulse of the motoring public, Rover responded with a racy new offering.
The P6, or rather the Rover 2000, as it'll be called when the secrecy surrounding its development is over, is a long, low, sleek piece of luxury and precision. It's a zippy light saloon that can seat a whole family with all the Rover comfort.
As we get to the 1960s, and the cars like the Rover 2000, I think of the thrusting young 60s executive in his mohair suit, shiny blue, sharp-edged trousers, and he's trying to impress the ladies in a very much a man's world at the time. And he's also thinking, I'm a bit of a Euro executive now, and I might even get to drive to France in my new Rover.
It's a free ride, this, not a test. It's a concours d'elegance, with the Rover 2000 eclipsing the continental scene. Where's the discerning motorist who would ever choose anything else?
It was a landmark. It was one of those remarkable episodes in the history of design that owed nothing to anything which preceded it. It was an entirely original concept of what a car should be.
The Rover P6 reflected British society more than any other Rover because it was clever. It had all this mechanical and technical audacity, and it was the brave new world of the 60s. This was really quite raffish and rakish and avant-garde, and it took old Rover customers with it as well, which was a really, really clever thing to do. I'm looking at the dashboard now and I've got recessed switches for safety and a lovely speedometer, which isn't a dial, it's a bar that goes along. I mean, this was clever stuff in 64. So, in that respect, Rover was really keeping pace with social change. This car was exactly attuned to its times.
To survive, they had to reach a bigger audience. They couldn't just think, right, Middle England is out there. More people were buying cars, and they had to cater for that. They couldn't get stuck in a rut and that we only sell to toffs. They had to start selling to new money.
A bigger market was a double-edged sword. The more people bought Rovers, the less desirable they became.
I think the class distinctions in Britain do shift in the 60s, and there's a much bigger middle class who can afford more as well. And also, relatively speaking, the price of cars is coming down. So when you can buy the car you aspire to, those cars lose their value, if you like, their kind of added value. And I think what happened is that people just could afford cars, and once you can afford them, you aspire something else.
British drivers may still have been heading off into the sunset behind the wheels of their Rovers, but there were clouds on the horizon. Competition from foreign car makers was on the increase. Received wisdom dictated that only the biggest companies would survive. Rover hastily merged with the likes of Triumph, Morris and Austin into the vast conglomerate of British Leyland. But in this case, bigger didn't mean better.
So it was a complete industrial muck-up on a massive scale.
British Leyland's assembly lines were dominated by Minis, Marinas, Princesses and Allegros. Rover was now keeping some decidedly down-market company. As it entered the 1970s, its snob value was slipping away.
Rover had taken on all that baggage from all these really lackluster, dying brands. So the tarnish, the corrosion, the sort of destruction of the Rover brand, of the Rover core values, wasn't helped by having to have all these other brands piggyback it. And the consumer didn't understand what was a Rover. And you knew, if you knew anything about cars, that your Rover was being made broadly in the same place, by the same people, using the same components and the same manufacturing processes as that little hideous Allegro with its Cortex steering wheel that everybody would laugh at. And that's when the rot, the real serious rot, started to set in.
Rover really started to lose its way in the 60s, kind of when it was bought out by British Leyland. And, you know, on the one hand, the Rover story is the story of a series of failed managements. But it's also a failure of branding. And Rover really needed to kind of stand for something that was a little bit more cool Britannia, and it never, ever worked out what that was going to be.
Rover's image was coming under siege in other ways. Anyone who says there's no such thing as bad publicity can never have followed the fortunes of British Leyland in the 1970s. The company became synonymous with industrial chaos, crippled by strikes and propped up by the long-suffering taxpayer. It was against this background that Rover had to launch its next generation of models.
Finally, somebody woke up and thought, right, we have to sort of... It's almost a case of starting again. And I guess that was the thinking behind it. We have this name, we have a brand, it's got to survive, so let's make something that not only the British will buy, but let's really develop something here.
In 1976, Rover hatched the SD1, their first big redesign in more than a decade. What looked like their last chance saloon quickly became Car of the Year. Customers queued up for the sleek, sporting sedan, which seemed free from any taint of the industrial chaos that had scarred British Leyland.
The SD1 was another astonishing concept. Like the old P5, it has a sort of a curious Italian influence.
It won Car of the Year in 1977, and everybody loved it because it had this scallop down the side and bore a sort of passing resemblance to a Ferrari Daytona.
It was unlike any Rover before. It was a hatchback. It was a big thing. It had rear-wheel drive. It was extremely commodious, and it had made some chunky design statements. And I thought the car looked absolutely wonderful.
The SD1 seemed positively miraculous, at least until you got it home.
The biggest problem was that Rover were building it down to a price. Also, they had a workforce which was very largely new to the job, and between them they managed to ensure that the quality was abysmal. So the car, although it won the Car of the Year 1977 award, very quickly got a bad reputation for build quality faults.
Now, some owners were lucky. The car rusted away long before it had a chance to actually disintegrate. But others, those who kept the car in a garage and waxed it to keep the evil rust at bay, had to simply sit by and watch as their beloved car disintegrated around them.
It rusted very quickly. In fact, some of them you just had to show them a damp chamois and they'd start rusting.
You'd open the glove box and it would be full of water, and your handbook and your little service book would be sopping wet.
And you'd get your luggage out of the boot after a long journey up to the Yorkshire Dales and have to hang all your washing on the line before you'd even worn it.
As far as the car-buying public was concerned, Rover had jettisoned its defining quality, which was, well, quality.
The physical quality of it was, it was atrocious. It would have brought, medieval bogmen into disrepute. I mean, it was so unintelligently made and so scandalously badly prepared.
Now, of course, today Rover builds its cars with a deal more integrity, but it is still tarred with the same brush that it earned for itself back in the late 70s. The country, nay the world, is full to overflowing with people who quite simply are not prepared to forgive or forget.
Beneath its wind tunnel sculpted exterior, the new Rover represented all that had gone wrong with British manufacturing. Mrs. Thatcher wouldn't touch it with a barge pole.
She made sure that the Ministry of Defence bought a dozen P5s in black so that she would never, ever have to drive a Rover SD1.
Oh, Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? My friends all drive Porsches. I must make amends.
The Thatcher era produced a new generation of aspiring professionals. For them, a car was less a statement about respectability and more a way of showing off the size of their bank balances. With its newly acquired reputation for dodgy workmanship, Rover stood little chance against the precision-tooled Teutonic competition of Porsche, Mercedes and BMW.
Society certainly changed from the 1980s onwards in terms of people's desires as they got greater income and greater knowledge of other things they might buy. For instance, people looked abroad, and increasingly in terms of cars, people would say, well, I'd like a BMW rather than a Rover.
And in this upwardly mobile decade, Rover's master plan seemed to be directed, strangely, downward. The Rover badge, already an object of declining currency, was now stuck on a whole range of British Leyland cars in an attempt to create a more marketing-friendly family of models. Even the Mini Metro was given a Rover makeover. It was a car that perfectly captured the Viking spirit of the brand, if a Viking was someone who spent most of their journeys nipping to the shops or church coffee mornings.
It was originally badged as an Austin, and it was only when the company took on the name of Rover that it was rebadged as a Rover, and then eventually became the Rover 100, using a name which had been used, of course, on the P4 saloons many years earlier. But badging it a Rover didn't really make it a Rover. Drives me up the wall.
Those cars didn't live up to the Rover name or expectations. So if you take a boring little car, stick a Rover badge on it, and all that car does is poodle down to the shops or poodle around National Trust car parks in second gear, you're going to destroy your brand, as this terrible word people keep using these days. But Rover did destroy its own brand.
In a further blow to the prestige of its brand, Rover had also returned to that old trick of sticking its badge on other people's technology. But rather than sporting a Buick engine under the bonnet, the new Rover was really a Japanese Honda in disguise. Cash-strapped British Leyland had done a deal with Honda to develop the new vehicles it couldn't afford to make on its own. Step up the mid-market 200 model. Lovers of plastic trim rejoiced. But was it really a Rover?
The Rover 200 is the result of collaboration between Austin Rover and the Japanese company Honda, and part of that deal is that a number of the component parts come in from Japan. The steering wheel, for example, is imported from Japan, although the badge is stuck on it here in Britain. And that's a Rover badge because that's what Austin Rover think will sell the car best. it could just as easily be a Honda badge sitting there, and indeed that's much of the flavour of the car. It's Japanese in feeling.
By the time a more upmarket Honda hybrid, the 800, arrived on the scene, Rover's pedigree mark had become something of a mongrel.
It never really felt like a Rover to me. I drove several of them, and although it's a high-quality car, it didn't feel like a Rover. It felt like a Honda with a Rover badge on.
Is it the man, or is it the Rover 800?
With the Rover 800, and I remember when it first appeared, it looked very good. It was low, it was svelte, it was reasonably racy. But again, you would get into the car and slam the door, and it just wouldn't thunk. It would clatter and clang. And the materials used, because cars are tactile, you know, you have to feel this stuff, this leather. It sends a message to the brain. But if it's a rather cheap, man-made sort of brine-nylon-y velour, it doesn't work. And if the ashtray doesn't close reassuringly, and if the windows don't go down nicely, it confuses you, and you begin to think, oh no, this isn't the haven of peace in a troubled world that I thought I'd bought.
Sleepy hands are creeping to the end of the clock.
When Rovers went the sort of Honda route with front-wheel drive and everything, they suddenly became deeply unsexy. And why would you buy a little Rover when you could have the same car with a Honda badge on it, which would probably actually have been built a lot better and work a lot better?
Show us the computer that can sense the pattern of grain or the flow of metal, and we'll show you a craftsman. The craftsmen who finish 80% of our new 800 coupe by hand.
It was time to move the crossbred Rovers firmly upmarket again. Rover's new bosses embarked on a grand, if predictable, plan. They looked back to the golden 1950s in an attempt to revive some of Rover's traditional hallmarks.
Rover cars that were built during my time, I mean, the objective was always to produce a high-quality car that had some distinction in the marketplace.
Using the old P5 as inspiration, Rover narrowed the essential ingredients for a successful car down to 3 specific details.
The grille, the leather, and the wood. And that, I think, was what we were trying to replicate in the more modern vehicles, exactly those attributes.
But Rovers struggled to move away from the middle of the road. As company cars, Rovers were selling well to corporate buyers, but this hardly lent them an air of exclusivity.
The problem with Rover was that it never defined the kind of mass market person who was going to buy into this premium proposition. And really kind of, you know, the idea that you're buying something that is the favourite choice of most fleet managers around the country is just not very aspirational. It's very hard to be a luxury brand and first choice of fleet managers.
That's why craftsmen finish 80% of our new 800 coupe by hand. The new 800 coupe.
In design terms, I guess it's right to say it's probably middle of the road. It's not startling, but it's like good taste. You know it when you see it, but it's not something that will set you back on your heels. It is a bit like ladies' fashions. You've got to be fashionable. You can be a little bit daring, but not too much. You know, if you take the skirt too high, nobody wants it.
Rover needed new backing and new blood. In 1994, it got them when it passed out of British hands and into BMWs. The Germans hadn't received such a warm welcome from the British since the days of Prince Albert. BMW had effectively replaced Rover as the supplier of executive cars for the middle classes. Surely, if anyone could give Rover a new lease of life, it was them. Expectations were high as the company spent a further 4 years developing its new flagship model. The Rover 75 was launched amidst unprecedented fanfare and optimism. It looked like the boys from Bavaria had done the trick. The 75 continued the attempt to hark back to the good old days of the post-war period, complete with chrome, a grille and wood trim.
The cabin in this range-topping connoisseur trim is straight from ye oldie worldy school of interior design. It's been given lashings of wood and a damn good hiding. Now, I know as well as you do that that's not such a big deal these days. You can get wooden leather on a Daewoo, for Pete's sake. But there's a difference. Other manufacturers slap a bit of it around to affect poshness. But with this Rover, you get the feeling that they started with the materials and then designed the cabin to suit. Still seems to be something missing, though. Ah, yes.
For somebody who wanted to have a car that was reliable, that stated that he was getting somewhere, maybe not quite to the top, but getting there, I think the Rover 75 in particular would meet all those requirements.
You have indeed.
But worryingly, the car's biggest admirers weren't exactly thrusting young executives.
I bought it before it came out, sort of thing, before it was really out, before it was launched. And I thought I read all about it and I saw it on a motor show. And I thought it was, if half what they say was true, well, then it was a good car.
It now seemed our patriotic duty to buy this German-owned car. The problem was that in looking to the past to recapture its glory, Rover seemed to have got stuck there.
The critical mistake was that the world had done so many revolutions that they just didn't understand about Beyoncé, about Destiny's Child, about Eminem, and about bling bling. You could never call the Rover 75 bling bling, and that's the problem. If they'd kept pace as BMW, as Mercedes, then it would have been fine, but it just stood there in its triple welted brogues and its yellow corduroy trousers and its sports jacket with its elbows with patches on, and said, doffing its hat and straightening its cravat, I'm British, I'm going to stay like this, and I'm going to sell. Hopeless, absolutely.
The Rover 75 seems to confirm something that I've long feared, that Britain is being turned into a fatuous theme park, obsessed with heritage and cowering behind a barricade of stupid nostalgic knickknacks. This is Rover! Rover! The company that gave us great cars like the P6, the SD1 and that experimental turbine car. I want something modern, not a great day out in history. This ridiculous hankering for the past is just not British. I can't stand it!
Sales of Rover cars slumped by a quarter last year, and next week the company, which is owned by BMW, is expected to announce losses of more than £600 million. The whole industry has been going through difficult times, but it's been worse for Rover than any other manufacturer.
BMW decided the game was up and sold Rover to some British investors for the derisory sum of £10. With no money to develop new models, the new regime fell back on that other Rover trick of rebadging foreign cars. But even the most seasoned Rover skeptics had a shock in store.
There we are. It's called the City Rover, and it's got 5 doors, very small car. It will cost between £6,500 and £8,500. That doesn't look, A, very nice, or B, anything like a Rover. And there's a very good reason for that. It's because it's actually made by a company called Tata in India, and then it's shipped over here where we nail some Rover badges to it. Why can't we do it?
The City Rover was it. When I saw that, I thought, that's it. This thing really is the worst thing they could have done. And you knew how bad things were when they're going to a third world manufacturer to produce a car that they thought they could flog to people in Britain. And they hoped just by changing the rear light clusters a little bit and sticking a Rover grille on the front that people wouldn't notice. But basically, it was just a very old and very bad design. I mean, it probably really, cut the scampi in downtown Delhi, but it just don't work in Chelsea.
Rover's Indian takeaway confirmed what many had suspected after the 75 failed to revive the company's fortunes. Rover was no longer about cars. It was about damage limitation in a region heavily dependent on the motor industry.
You have to say that there was enormous skill, and they did try very hard to breathe new life into these ossified old platforms of cars that really were massively underdeveloped. And for 5 years, they did a half-decent job. And they kept, let's not forget this, they kept the West Midlands in employment, 30,000 people, for 5 long years. And that is an achievement which should not be taken away from them.
Thousands of workers at MG Rover have been told to go home until further notice, with union leaders claiming the chances of a rescue deal are now 1,000,000 to 1. At a mass meeting this morning, they were told Rover is losing at least £20 million a month, and a government loan would only keep them on the payroll for a week.
Perhaps it's not surprising that the cars have been forgotten in the general lamentation this year at the demise of Rover. Thousands of job losses is a tragedy that makes the death of a brand pale into insignificance. Yet, like many tragedies, this one had an air of inevitability to it.
The truth is that, for the past 30 years, Rover has just been acting out an embarrassing, long death agony. It's been a sort of, a feeble parody of vitality, kept alive only by misguided sentiment and half-hearted investment.
All these people that are mourning the loss of Rover have probably bought a Toyota or a Nissan or a Honda or an Audi, so they only have themselves to blame to a degree, but you can't blame them for buying cars that are well built.
This outpouring of sentiment isn't about a car company. It's a much greater thing that bothers us subliminally, and that is the loss of British engineering supremacy. And the fact that the Chinese are now becoming the preeminent industrialised society, and that virtually everybody else in the world can do things better and cheaper than we can. That is what bothers us in our beds at night.
But every dog has its day. And as we lie awake at night, we can at least seek solace in our walnut-veneered memories.
Time Shift recalls the winter of 1973 next on BBC4, when the unions and the government almost brought the country to its knees in Switch Off Something.